Hello, my name's Kuenzler, and I'm delighted to come along and talk to you all today and to say hello to all the teachers, children, and staff involved in this wonderful project being run by the Elliott Foundation. And it's absolutely fantastic that they've invited me along to read to you and share a little bit about the background to my new novel, Our Beautiful Game. And I know you're all going to, have some copies of the book available and be able to read on, perhaps after I've told you a little bit about it and read you a tiny bit from it. Basically, it's a story set during the First World War, that terrible, terrible war that was fought in trenches when Britain fought Germany in the beginning of the last century, 1914 to 1918, so sort of just over 100 years ago. And it was a terrible war, and many young boys and young men lost their lives. But I'm actually focusing on the girls and women back home in this story, because they too actually did some very dangerous things that I think haven't necessarily been something that we've been so aware of until now. You know, they worked in very dangerous munitions factory, making ammunition and bullets and guns and things to help that war effort that was going on with the fighting. But it was also a time of incredible adventure and excitement for young girls, often as young as 11, 12 years old, probably similar age to what some of you might be at the moment. Because prior to that, these girls might have gone off and been sent off to work as servants in big grand houses. And if they did that, they wouldn't have got very much free time at all. They were kept really hard working. And if any free time they did get, they'd have probably been on their own with perhaps one other friend, one other young person free at the same time as them. When they got to the factories, the munitions factories during the war, suddenly there were lots of girls and young women all having free time together in a factory forecourt, like a courtyard, and they were all there at the same time, a bit like a school break time. And that was amazing. And crucially for our story, they were also wearing trousers. And so it's no surprise really that at this time football became incredibly popular amongst young women and girls in a way the game just hadn't been previously. So much so that by the end of the war, women's matches, professional women's matches, big stadium matches were going on all over the place, and women were playing football in front of sell-out crowds of men and families and women and other girls all coming to watch these matches. And that was slightly the problem, is it got so popular that when the men started to come back from war, at the end of the war, the FA, the Football Association, began to worry a bit that the women's game would be in competition a bit with the men's game. And so they put a ban on it. Overnight, they said, women cannot play on any of our pitches, any pitch owned by the FA. So all the big stadiums, anywhere like Newcastle United, Arsenal, Stamford Bridge, stadiums, huge stadiums from the same sort of teams that you would now know from the Premiership. They were playing at pitches that belonged to those sort of teams. But the FA said overnight, no, you can't play on those pitches anymore. And you can't have any of our officials referee your matches. And so the women's game was sent suddenly back to being played in tiny little, factory forecourts or bits of waste ground, and was it was a stranglehold that was put on women's football for 50 years. That ban stayed in place, and it came into place 100 years ago this year. So it was brought in December 1921, so almost exactly 100 years ago. So it was just a story that really fascinated me, and there were lots of incredible characters like the famous Lily Parr, who was 12 years old when she first started playing these huge football matches, and 14 when she was scoring masses and masses of goals, and she remains one of the greatest goal scorers who's ever been in England. Look her up if you haven't heard of her, Lily Parr. Other players like Alice Wood. So I invented a player called Polly who draws on the real story, and mine's an invented imaginary story, but it draws on the real life and that passion for the game and that terror of war that was going on at the same time. And if you don't like football, this is not all about football. this book. It's about all sorts of things. It's not just about girls either. It's about Polly's brother going off to war and the other young men in the same community. And it's about friendship and about the threat of war and living through a time like that and working and the excitement of having a job and growing up and being out in the world. So it covers all sorts of things, all brought together in this factory where Polly ends up working in this new life that she discovers beyond home, and all sorts of new experiences open up for her. But I'm going to start at the very beginning, where she is at home and she's playing football, which is what Polly most likes to do. Chapter 1, Lowcross, Lancashire, July 1917. So we're in the middle of the First World War. Polly charged across the backyard, flicked the football onto the toe of her left boot and eyed up the goal. All that stood between her and victory were 3 fat piglets, the washing tub and a gaggle of chicks. She darted forward, weaved between 2 of the chicks and thundered down the right-hand side of the yard. Polly was about to take a shot at goal, which was a narrow slit between 2 clean sheets hanging on the washing line, when out of nowhere the fattest of the piglets blocked her path. She almost lost control of the ball in a puddle of slops and slippery potato peel. "Oh, no, you don't," she slithered sideways, flicking the ball upwards in the nick of time before skidding to the ground. Her nostrils filled with the familiar stench of pig muck and rotting veg, but it was worth it. The ball sailed through the air. "Goal!" She smiled as it disappeared between the sheets, then waited, expecting to hear the satisfying thud of leather on wood as it hit the back gate. But the thud never came. Instead, Joe, the eldest of her 5 brothers, appeared. "Hello, Poll, you lost something." He smiled down at her, holding the muddy ball. "Give it here," said Polly, sitting up and trying not to gawp. Joe was in his new army uniform. She'd never seen him look so smart. She couldn't remember a time when anyone in their family had ever had new clothes. "What do you reckon?" Joe beamed as he took one hand off the ball to salute her. "Not too shabby, I suppose." Polly heaved herself up off the filthy ground. Her fingers were covered in muck, but she wanted to reach out and touch his jacket. It was brown, like the colour of strong tea, so stiff it looked more as though it was made of cardboard than cloth. Polly was 12 years old and tall for her age, especially for a girl, as people never tired of telling her. She was nearly the same height as Joe, even though he had just turned 18 and had shoulders as broad as a bear. Yet all trussed up in his fancy clothes, he seemed young somehow, like a little boy. His big ears were sticking out from under his cap, and his bristly chin was shaved clean. Apart from the thick soldier's belt around his middle, he looked as if he was off to church, not away to fight a war. Polly made a swipe for the ball, waving her grimy paws at him. "Hand it over, then, unless you want to get muddy," she said. "Get away, Poll." Joe marched past her, dunked the leather football in the pig's water trough, and shook it dry. "That beauty's coming with me." "What?" Polly's mouth fell open in disbelief. "You can't take my ball to the war." Joe raised an eyebrow. "All right, your ball," said Polly weakly. Joe had won it in a game of poker off a lad at the works, and she knew it, but that wasn't going to stop her. "You're supposed to be out there fighting Jerry, not playing football," she said. "Yeah, that's where you're wrong." Joe leaned up against the wall and took out a smoke, with the ball wedged safely under his boot. "Haven't you ever heard of No Man's Land?" "Course I have," said Polly. "It's the scrap of ground that runs between the trenches, the German ones and the ones our boys are stuck in." She'd heard enough stories about the war to know that. "Exactly." Joe pointed to the pig's water trough. "Say that over there's our lad's trench, then this here," he kicked the long, narrow slop feeder with his boot. "This here is Jerry's." Polly laughed as a gaggle of chicks waddled merrily between the trough and the feeder. "In that case, someone ought to tell those little beggars they're right in the middle of no man's land." "They wouldn't last long," said Joe gravely. "It's where you get yourself blown up, Poll." She saw him swallow hard. "That rotten little strip of land's what we're all fighting over." "Like a football pitch," said Polly with a shudder. "Reckon you might be right," Joe agreed. "The trenches are like goals, and each team is trying to fire their shots into the others." "Except it's bombs and shells they're shooting, not footballs," thought Polly. But neither of them needed to hear that said out loud, not when Joe was shipping off to the battlefield in just a few hours' time. He'd stubbed out his cigarette, but was still chewing his lip. "I don't see what any of that's got to do with you taking my ball," said Polly with a cheeky grin. Inside, she felt all shivery at the thought of Joe going away, but she was desperate to lift the mood. She and Joe had never had a serious conversation in their whole lives. It certainly didn't seem like a good moment to start. "My ball," said Joe firmly. But he was grinning now too. Although Joe was the oldest of her 5 brothers, Polly felt closer to him than any of the others. You could tell at a glance they were related. They had the same wild black hair, deep-set grey eyes and big wide mouths. The point is this, Poll. Joe kicked the ball lightly from one foot to the other. If you've heard of No Man's Land, then you must have heard of the Christmas football matches. Polly had, but she let him tell her anyway. It was 1914, the first year of the war, Joe said. He always told a good story, and his eyes sparkled as he spoke. The 2 sides decided to call a truce. Just for a few hours, they all stopped fighting because it was Christmas time, and they probably missed home like Billy-O. Joe's voice was sing-song, as if he was telling some magical fairy tale. There was frost in the air, and the lads on both sides sung carols between the trenches. Then someone lobbed a ball into No Man's Land, and they all had a bit of a kickabout. That's as may be. You still can't have my ball, said Polly, folding her arms when Joe was finished. From what I hear, lads aren't larking around out there playing football these days. They're too busy killing each other. The moment the words were out, Polly wished she could stuff them back in again. She saw Joe's face turn white as the sheets on the line. She'd only meant to tease him, hoping he'd let her keep the ball, but now she'd said that awful thing about killing, and it was true. Joe wasn't going to be playing football, not for a very long time. He'd be too busy fighting in the endless, horrible, stupid war. Me and my big gob, she thought. Why did she never think before she spoke? Keep the rotten ball, Joe. Why? He glared at her, his grey eyes dark. Out of pity, could he figure I might go out there and die? No, said Polly quickly. Her tummy flipped over as a hot blush burned her face. She couldn't let Joe see that was exactly what she had been thinking. There's only one way to settle this, she said, standing tall and pushing her shoulders back. I'm a striker, and you reckon yourself a great goalie. Let's shoot it out. Winner keeps the ball. So they have a competition to see who can keep the ball. And I don't think I'm giving too much away to say that Polly wins, and then she finishes, and Joe says, I didn't think you stood a chance. I'd never have let you challenge me, Joe snapped. He was a decent fellow, but he still didn't like being beaten by his little sister. Why? Because I'm younger than you, said Polly. Or because I'm a girl? Joe said nothing. He didn't need to. Well, you better get used to it. Polly turned her back and gently lifted the chicks from the bucket, placing them back on the ground. I'm growing up fast, she told him. I plan to go on beating you boys from now on, no matter how big and strong and tough you think you are. Just you wait and see. And I'll just read you one tiny bit more where Polly first sees the factory, where she ends up getting a job. She's been sent off to get a job in a fancy house as a scullery maid, basically in a little dark room behind the kitchen, peeling potatoes and washing pans all day. And Polly doesn't fancy the idea of that, but Mum said she has to go off and get a job, even though, as we know, she's only 12 years old. But she's ready to leave school and go off and do that. Polly had never been on the far side of the station. There hadn't been any reason to. As Mum said, it was just a couple of big factories tucked away in the back there, before you got out towards the edge of town and the fancy houses up on the hill. Although it wasn't yet light, it was a lovely crisp morning without any rain for once. Polly swung her arms, enjoying the walk. If she was going to be cooped up in some little scullery from now on, she might as well make the most of the fresh air while she could. Not that it was fresh exactly. It was full of smoke and steam from the factories. But it still felt good to be out and about and free. She darted forward, dodging around a lamppost and kicking an imaginary ball in the air. Blast! Polly felt a gush of icy water splash up the inside of her legs. Looking down in the gaslight, she saw she'd stepped straight into a big muddy pothole right up to her shins. Her skirt was dripping wet and covered in slimy mud all around the hem. She remembered, too late, she'd promised Mum to lift her skirt. What was the point in wearing something you had to hitch up the whole time? As she bent down to inspect the mess, Mum's hat fell off in the puddle too. Mum had made her wear her fancy hat to look good for the interview. Blinking heck, Polly cursed, scooping up the soggy hat and putting it on top of the postbox for a moment as she leaned against the high brick wall at the side of the road. She clutched the bottom of her skirt and wrung it out with both hands. A stream of muddy water splashed onto the ground. Polly was just wondering what she was going to do about the thick brown ring of mud all around the hem when she heard a familiar sound. The thwack of leather. She let go of her skirt and pricked up her ears. Football. There was a game going on. Polly could hear it. The scuff of feet and the thud of the ball just on the other side of the wall. Instinctively, she looked up. The brick wall must have been about 10 or 12 feet high. There was no way she'd ever be able to see over it. "Here!" someone cried out. "Pass to me!" Polly smiled. From the sound of the voice, it appeared to be a girl shouting, but she couldn't be sure. Suddenly a loud cheer went up, and a great whoosh of voices all together. "Goal!" Polly was amazed. That definitely sounded like girls. Lots of them. She started to run as fast as her legs would carry her, darting along beside the wall, frantically searching for some way to see in. As she pelted round the corner, she found a pair of high iron gates with a big yellow sign hanging across them. "Low Cross Munitions Factory. Authorised workers only. Keep out." Polly skidded to a halt and peered through the iron bars. Even in the grey morning gloom, she had a clear view of the factory forecourt, which was lit up by lights all around the side. Polly held her breath and stared. All thoughts of the big fancy house and the job on Lilac Hill vanished from her head. She was right. Girls were playing football together. Lots of them, all running about, shouting and kicking the ball. So I hope that's given you a taste of what our beautiful game is about, and that you'll enjoy reading the story. And if you do, make sure you look up about the truth of the history at the time, both for young girls and for young boys, and all the things that were happening in this extraordinary time when the world kind of changed. Our views about how we live our lives, who we were, views about things like class and race and sex and all sorts of things changed at this time, and they're all sort of dealt with in this book. Lots of ideas about how children were treated and how young adults were treated, and it's just a fascinating moment in time, and fascinating too to think at the beginning of the real passion that girls and young women have for football today. So I do hope you enjoy our beautiful game. I can hear my dog barking now. He wants me to take him for a walk, so I better go. I don't know if you can hear that, but I can hear my dog walking, so I'm off to give him, I can hear my dog barking, so I'm off to give him a walk, and I hope you enjoy having a lovely read. Thank you again to the Elliott Foundation for inviting me along. Bye-bye.